Hi class, for the Memoir, Memory, and Mastery presentation project, I read the book Mi Voz Mi Vida. So here's an overview of Mi Voz Mi Vida. Mi Voz Mi Vida was written by Andrew Garrod, Robert Kilkenny, and Christina Gomez in 2007. This book presents a collection of stories grouped by their commonalities, told by Latino college students as they reflect on their lives. It highlights the struggles and triumphs of growing up and navigating life in the U.S. as a Latino learner. These stories reveal both the academic journey and the personal life of each student balanced along the way. They reveal resiliency and the power of our words and actions as each individual constructs their own personal identity in a world prevalent with labels, stereotypes, biases, and misconceptions. Ultimately, these stories illuminate the diverse experiences of Latino students in the U.S. and how these experiences shape the person that each individual becomes. Now, in terms of multicultural education, there is a common theme of a lack of multicultural education throughout the story, and this unfortunately led to many obstacles for each student that they wouldn't have faced otherwise. For example, a lot of the students struggle with their identity throughout the story, and a lot of times it's because of what they were taught in school and the fact that they didn't see that representation of their own culture and the diverse experiences of other Latino learners. A lot of these students later, when they left and went to college and were able to connect with other students from that similar culture, they were able to construct that identity and the sense of self, whereas they weren't able to in K 12 education. Likewise, multicultural education provides a platform for students to learn more about the complexities of culture and identity, and this provides the space for each student to construct their own understanding. And it's my personal opinion that this should happen in K 12 education so that students don't have to go through some of those obstacles as the students in our stories faced. In terms of which voices that resonated with me personally, I chose three. The first one is Marissa, and the reason I chose Marissa is because she felt like she didn't fit into any label. So Holly and Nieto stated that all students bring cultural values and experiences to their education, yet schools frequently disregard them, particularly teachers that are unfamiliar with their students' cultures. That's from page 69. And I found this with Marissa. Her father wanted her to see herself as Mexican American, as American Mexican. This was something that was based on his experiences, so he really wanted her to put that American part first instead of Mexican first, and it's very likely because of the experiences that he faced as a student and the prejudice he saw in the schools with being Mexican. And this is just kind of a question of that multicultural education and whether he would have felt so strongly about that had he have experienced that identity affirming instruction. Likewise, Jose, he tried so hard to distinguish himself from his perception of being Latino. He talked about the negative stereotypes, and he realized later in life he held them as well as some of his own misconceptions about being Latino, and he always tried to work hard to overcome what he thought it meant. But then he took a trip to Honduras with his family, and he learned after a young boy tried to jump on the back of their car, and he saw that desperation and what that boy's experiences had led him to, and he realized that by his family leaving and immigrating to the US and all of the struggles they had faced, he saw the resiliency in his family and all of those admirable traits, and he began to reconstruct his own biases. Lastly, Angelita felt very isolated, and that was kind of the theme throughout her story. She was struggling to succeed academically and also facing challenges in her personal life. She was the one that had the story. They had brought family members from the country her family was from to live with them, and she didn't really fit in with them and felt like they resented her. Her parents went through a terrible divorce. Her mother grew ill, her father grew ill. She was balancing all of this and having to be very mature as a teenager while also trying to balance her academics so that she could ultimately go to college. And this story really does highlight the obstacles that many students go through that put them at a disadvantage when compared to their peers. Now, the challenges and opportunities that each student faced, it did differ. The book really did highlight the diverse experience of being Latino in the U.S. Now, Darlene Hammond stated that only about 40% of American young people and fewer than 20% of African American and Hispanic youth receive a college or university degree, and that's compared to almost half of students in Canada. And that's from paragraph 6. And then I went ahead and grouped this into 3 different categories that I noticed as the overarching challenges. Like I said, it was very diverse, but these were kind of the 3 that I noticed throughout the stories. The first one is labels. It seemed like a lot of students struggle with their identity because they didn't fit any specific label. And as humans, we do struggle with wanting to put labels on things. And as such, we want to put them on people as well. And I noticed throughout this, one of the big challenges they faced is that concept of putting labels on things and on people as well. Likewise, a lot of them struggle with personal or home circumstances. They had other additional barriers outside of the classroom that they were facing as well. Lastly, they struggled with a lot of stereotyping. So, like we mentioned with Jose's story of the misconceptions that he had about what it meant to be Latino and how he was struggling even with being Latino and stereotyping other Latinos. Likewise, a lot of students struggle with stereotyping of what it meant to be in the ESL program or other common labels. Again, it kind of goes back to that label idea. So these students did face significant challenges that a lot of their peers did not. Now, if it was me and I was a teacher in this setting, what would I do to assist these students in becoming successful socially and academically? And I really broke it down into 3 categories again. The first thing is I do think a multicultural education approach is the best approach for supporting these students. What that means to me is that students need to be reading books about people that look like them and have similar cultural experiences and ideology. Likewise, the project should allow for that cultural difference, and they should also be learning about other cultures as well and learning about the diversity within cultures. Likewise, family engagement. I think that this is something that a lot of students had that theme that their families were separate from their education, and that even some students mentioned being kind of embarrassed for their parents to be involved if they didn't speak very good English. And I think that this is just a shame, and this is something that's on the school's behalf that it has happened. And so for me, if I were to teach in a school again, this would be something that I would definitely put emphasis on, is that family engagement piece and making sure that I have a classroom that families feel comfortable engaging in. Lastly, I think it's vital for teachers to use trauma-informed teaching practices, and particularly I noticed this with behavior. And Murphy stated that school culture and the structures and support systems in schools, like the school environment, amplify or at least fail to reduce pattern learning differentials by race and social class. This is something I've personally noticed while I was a teacher. I noticed that a lot of times the teaching practices reveal a self-fulfilling prophecy. If teachers have a misconception or a bias against a group of students and they set low expectations and they're using threats and other means to try to get behavior to where they need it to be, a lot of times it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and these students will act out in that way. And I think that it's vital for teachers to use trauma-informed teaching practices and to also set that high expectation. Now, there are many different approaches to that, but I think positive reinforcement is a great one, setting those positive expectations. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. Now, in terms of the connection to society as a whole, and this also kind of goes down to organizations as well, such as districts, or even like my setting, I work in higher education and colleges in general. And I think the first thing is conversations about stereotyping, biases, and misconceptions. I think this is a huge missing piece. We're kind of starting to have the conversations about what it means to stereotype, implicit biases, misconceptions, and kind of having those open conversations. But I still think that there's room for dialogue about that, and also professional development on what it is, because it's not quite widespread. And hopefully in the future it will become widespread that these conversations will be happening. Likewise, I think it shows a need for social justice. We've saw some advancements in this area, and I think that we just continue to need to see more advancements. And I think this is where the advocacy piece comes in. Likewise, educational reform. A lot of this class has been centered on the idea of educational reform and what needs to happen for that to occur. And I think it's just something that's so important in our society. We do not provide an equitable education in the K-12 educational setting. And that is something that we need to improve on. Likewise, lastly, representation. I still think that we are growing in this area, but it needs to continue to improve, whether it's children seeing themselves represented in literature or in toys or on the media, anywhere like that. I think representation is vital. Now, to summarize my personal and professional learning, I just broke it down into each piece, the personal learning and then the professional learning. So personally, kind of my big take away from this is that it's okay to have complex views of our own identity and to hold space for the complexities of the human experience. And just like we talked about with a lot of the students from the stories, trying to avoid labels. We don't want to just put a label on exactly how we think we are and what we think we identify as, but more so just understanding the complexities of it's not always a label that can capture the way that we feel or the experiences we've had. Sometimes labels can be helpful if those are something that we've chosen for ourselves, but other than that, it's important to avoid labeling others and then also to just take a holistic view of ourselves. Likewise, like I mentioned, it is vital to hold space for the complexities that others bring. And then lastly, for personal gain, I really realized, and this is something I've been working on for a long time, but that's that words and actions have a lasting impact. So we need to make sure that as we're talking, we choose them wisely. And this is something I noticed throughout Mi Voz Mi Vida, is that a lot of times things were said that had a huge impact, but they were said kind of carelessly but without malicious intent. For example, jokes that we make or things like that. So just being careful of what those words and actions could be creating, which, like I said, it doesn't always have to be a malicious intent, but sometimes the way that they come out, they are perceived in a way that creates these negative misconceptions and stereotypes and other types of harmful things. Now, professionally, one of the big takeaways is that relationships are key, but so is information. And partnerships with families and individual learners, they're crucial to support those learners. And lastly, just a major part of being a professional in the field of education is advocacy. I think that's true in K-12, which is where I came from before, and also in higher education, which is where I work at now. Now, in terms of further research, a lot of this does focus on K-12 education because that is kind of where I'm leaning towards working in the future again. So the first question I had is, how can teachers working in low-income schools best approach reframing the mindset around school after students have built years of negative feelings surrounding education? And the reason I'd like to research this is because when I have observed in upper grades classrooms, I've primarily worked in lower grades, but when I have observed in those upper grades, a lot of times one of the things that I've noticed is that those students have a very firm, ingrained ideology of what school is. And a lot of times it's not a positive thought. It's not a positive schema about what school is. So I'm just curious, how can teachers working with students in those upper grades rebuild that idea of what school is and what it means to just be yourself at school and to be valued at school? And secondly, how can educators, advisors, etc., anyone basically working in the field of education, find resources to support these students as we do work on building a rapport with them and begin learning more about their lives outside of school? Because a lot of times I think, especially in advising, I know I'm always telling students, let me know what I can do to support you, but a lot of times I don't actually have those resources available. So that's one thing I'm always looking for, just suggestions on actual resources that can offer support, whether it's more of like advice or actual physical resources that can alleviate some of the strain that students are going through. And here are my references that I mentioned before earlier in the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed.